Alright, hockey card fans, welcome back. Went to a new place last week called Beyond the Pond. It's in London, Ontario. It's up on Hyde Park and North Rutledge. And it's way back of a little business complex area. I went there because I went to another place on Exeter Road that sold hockey cards, but they don't sell vintage. But they suggested this place, so I made a call, found out where it was, and found out they do vintage, and went and checked it out. Pretty good guy. Talked to him for about half an hour or so, as well as got some hockey cards, and probably will go back there. But anyway, we got cards from two different sets, and let's get into it. So the first set I got here is the 1972 O-pee-chee set. So this is the 71-72 stat year when the Boston Bruins won a Stanley Cup. Their second Stanley Cup in 3 years. And then the Canada Cup happened that September. And the first player we're going to look at is Boston Bruins left winger Johnny Bucyk. This is a beautiful card. It is. These had the yellow-orange. They had an orangey back with a cartoon. I love the cartoons. Gives you a little bit more personal history of the players. Johnny Bucyk is, of course, in the Hockey Hall of Fame. He was a two-time Stanley Cup winner, two-time All-Star, two-time Lady Byng winner, and on the 100th anniversary team. Ended his career playing over 1,500 games with 556 goals for 1,369 points. Was a plus-minus of -7, which isn't good. But he only took 493 penalties minutes in his entire career, which isn't bad. That's why he won the Lady Byng. Played his entire career at Boston. Appeared in 5 Stanley Cups. And he lost 3 of them. They lost 2 to Montreal and they lost another one to Philly. But then they beat St. Louis and beat the Rangers. He actually started his career with the Detroit Red Wings. Way back in 1955. And in 1957 on June 10th he was traded from Detroit with cash to Boston Bruins for Terry Sawchuk. So one Hall of Famer for another one. Sawchuk was a really good goalie, and he took the Wings to the Stanley Cup, Sawchuk. Now, 1972 was also an expansion year. This is when the New York Islanders and Atlanta Flames came in the league, and so I have Atlanta Flames defenseman Ron Harris. This card has some soft corners, but otherwise is in great shape. Nothing wrong with the back. Ron Harris started his career with the Detroit Red Wings, then went to the Oakland Seals in the expansion draft, went back to the Red Wings, then was taken by the Atlanta Flames in expansion, then went to the New York Rangers. 476 games, 20 goals for 111 points, 28 playoff games, 7 points. So not exactly a household name. The trades, these are what I like. So May of 1965 traded from Detroit with Bob Dillabaugh, Albert Langlois, and Parker McDonald to Boston Bruins from Bob McCord, Ad McDonald, and Ken Stevenson. No idea who would win that one. 67 claimed an expansion draft, and then 68 traded from Oakland Seals with Bob Bond to Detroit for Gary Jarrett, Doug Roberts, Howie Young, and Chris Worthy. Both teams were brutal in the late 60s, early 70s, so can't say who won that deal. Claimed an expansion draft by Atlanta Flames, and then traded from Atlanta to New York Rangers for Kurt Bennett. Atlanta won that deal. Go to the Minnesota North Stars. Right winger Lou Nanne. Played a lot of years in the U.S. for the University of Minnesota, Rochester Mustangs, the United States Hockey League. Got to the Minnesota North Stars in 67. Played for the U.S. Olympic team, even though he's born in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. So he must have become a nationalized citizen. Played his entire career with the Minnesota North Stars. He played 635 games, 68 goals, 225 points, 32 playoff games, 4 goals, 10 assists for 14 points. Was probably your third line guy because he only scored more than 20 goals once in his career. And he 77-78 he retired and then became the coach midway through the season. He was 7-18-4 out of the playoffs. He did become their general manager and was more successful. Now we're going to go with New York Rangers center Gene Rotella. Many of his cards This card has, other than a little ding in the top corner, is in beautiful shape. Rattel is in the Hall of Fame. He won the 70-71 Masterton, 2 Lady Bings, the 70-71, 71-72 Pearson, one-time All-Star, like selected All-Star, and then he was on the 100th anniversary team. He was in the Summit Series, and he was part of the gag line, the goal of game line with Vic Hatfield and Rod Gilbert. He's also famous for being part of the Phil Esposito trade, which sent Esposito and Vadnais to the Rangers in exchange for Rattel and Park. So he played for 2 teams his whole career, played 20 years in the NHL, retired in 81. Never won a Stanley Cup, but went to 3 Stanley Cup finals, where they lost to Boston because he was with the Rangers, and then they lost to Montreal twice when he was in Boston. 1,280 games, 491 goals, 1,267 assists, a plus-minus of 236, which is pretty good. In the playoffs, 123 games, 32 goals, 66 assists for 98 points. And then we have a goalie for the Pittsburgh Penguins. This is a rookie card. And it's Jim Rutherford. He is actually in the Hall of Fame as a builder with the, I think for the Carolina Hurricanes. He helped build them. He started his career in Detroit in 70-71, where he played 29 games. Then he played 40 games in Pittsburgh and finally gets a card. Spent two and a half seasons with Pittsburgh before going back to Detroit. Spent the rest of the 70s in Detroit. Went to the Maple Leafs. In fact, he played for 3 teams in 1980-81. Played for the Wings, the Leafs, and the Kings. 3 of the worst teams you could be on in the 80s. Then he went back to Detroit for 1 more game before retiring. So he played in 457 games, NHL games. He was 151 wins, 227 losses with 59 ties. He had 14 shutouts in his career with a 3.66 goals against average and a 0.879 save percentage. He played on a lot of bad teams. In fact, the best team he probably played for in his career was the Pittsburgh Penguins, because Pittsburgh actually had a decent team in the mid-70s. Alright, so he played 8 playoff games, won 2 games, both with Detroit, lost 5. So he had a 3.82 goals against average in the playoffs with only a .883 save percentage. So not exactly your household name as far as goaltenders go. So he was claimed in the interleague draft by the Pittsburgh Penguins from Detroit Red Wings. That was in June of 71. Then in January 17, 74, traded from Pittsburgh Penguins with Jack Lynch to Detroit Red Wings for Ron Stackhouse. Ron Stackhouse was a fairly decent defenseman in the mid-70s. Then traded from Detroit to Toronto for Mark Kirkton. Detroit won that trade because Kirkton was much better than Rutherford. Then he was traded from Toronto to LA for a round 5 pick in the 81 draft. So LA needed a goalie briefly, a backup anyway, and they got him. Alright, so those are 5 cards from the 72 O-pee-chee set that I got. So the next set I have is from the 1973 O-pee-chee set. So the 72-73 stat year. This is when the Montreal Canadiens won another Stanley Cup. It was also Guy Lafleur's first Stanley Cup. And it's also famous for Kenny Dryden semi-retiring after the Stanley Cup because Montreal wouldn't meet his contract demands. But anyway, the first card we're going to go to is Philadelphia Flyers goalie Bernie Parent. This card's in decent shape. And it was supposedly $5. I think he gave me a discount on that. I'm not sure. So I didn't pay much for these cards. For 12 cards, I paid only $40. So I'm not sure how much I paid for some of these. So Bernie Parent is obviously in the Hall of Fame. I think he just died recently too. He won 2 Stanley Cups, 2 Conn Smythes, 2 All-Stars, 2 Vezinas, and on the 100th anniversary team. Started his career with Boston, then went to Philly, then to Toronto. Spent a year in the WHA with the Philadelphia Blazers, 72-73. And then went to back to Philadelphia. So he didn't like Toronto. In fact, the stats you see on the back of the stats you see on the back of this card are his Philadelphia Blazer stats. where he played 63 games, had a 3.61 goals against average, and then 2 shutouts. So obviously he wanted out of Toronto, which a lot of players did, because Harold Ballard was really stingy with money. So they went to the W for a lot more money. Mike Pellick did the same thing. A couple other Leafs. Blaine Stoughton. Anyway, in 608 NHL games, he was 271 wins, 198 losses, 119 ties. That's a lot of ties. He had a .915 save percentage with a 2.55 goals against average. Playing in Toronto didn't help his goals against average, but he had 2 back-to-back 12 shutout seasons. 74-75, he recorded 12 shutouts back-to-back, 54 throughout his career. So in 1974, he played 73 games, which is pretty much the entire season for them. 47, 13, and 12, with a 1.89 goals against average and 12 shutouts. Considering the equipment they used back then, that's a phenomenal. And the fact that no one on the Philadelphia Flyers defense is in the Hockey Hall of Fame. That's pretty amazing. So in June of 67, he was claimed in the expansion draft by Philadelphia from Boston. That's why Boston lost him. Plus Boston had Jerry Cheevers and Eddie Johnston. Then in January 31st, 71, he was traded from Philadelphia with a round 2 pick in the 71 draft to Toronto for Bruce Campbell, Mike Walton, and a number 1 pick in the 71 draft. Philly won the deal because they got him back for nothing. Plus they got Mike Walton, Shaky Walton, who they later dealt. In fact, they traded Shaky Walton to Boston for Rick McLeish, who was part of their Stanley Cup wins. So big win for Philly there. Anyway, moving forward, speaking of Toronto, we have the Toronto Maple Leafs team card. So their team photo. On the back of these, it just gives their stats like best season, most Stanley Cup wins, all that stuff. Just stats about the team. Doesn't give an actual checklist of the players. That's something that wouldn't come till later. So that season is one of the first where they actually released team photo cards. Now we have Montreal Canadiens left winger Frank Mahovlich. This card is in pretty good shape. It says $6 on the back. I don't think I paid $6 though for it. I think he's just trying to get rid of these. Frank Mahovlich is in the Hockey Hall of Fame. He's a 6-time Stanley Cup winner. He won the 1957-58 Calder Trophy, 9-time All-Star, and is on the 100th anniversary team. Played for the Toronto Maple Leafs for 10 years, then went to Detroit for 3.5 years, then went to Montreal. Played with them for 3.5 years. Then jumps to the WHA and plays for the Toronto Toros and the Birmingham Bulls. In 18 NHL years, he had played over 1,100 games, 533 goals, 1,103 points with a .266 plus minus. Even in the WHA, 237 games, he had 89 goals for 232 points. So he's still producing the W at the age of 40. He won 4 Stanley Cups with Toronto and 2 more with Montreal. Montreal was going with a youth movement, so they moved him after 74. That's when he decided to jump to the W. So in 137 playoff games, he had 51 goals, 67 assists for 118 points. He was a minus 25 though. Helped Montreal win 2 cups, especially the 71. And I think having him and Pete together made his decision to go to Montreal a lot easier. So in 16, he was traded from Toronto with the rights to Carl Brewer, Pete Stemkowski, and Gary Unger to Detroit for Doug Barry, Paul Henderson, Floyd Smith, and Norm Ullman. Neither team won that deal because Detroit never got back to prominence, and Frank would eventually go to Montreal. Pete Stemkowski would go to the Rangers. Paul Henderson would go to the WHA. So would Norm Ullman. And Norm Ullman would also go to the WHA. January 13th, 71, traded from Detroit to Montreal for Guy Sharon, Bill Collins, and Mickey Redmond. Mickey Redmond scored 52 goals one year. He was a pretty good player for Detroit, but Detroit was a brutal team. Next up we have the guy who was traded for Mike Walton, Philadelphia Flyers left winger Rick McLeish. Big part of their Stanley Cup runs, McLeish was. He was actually drafted in the first round, 4th overall in the 1970 draft by the Boston Bruins. And he played with Philadelphia Flyers for 11 years before moving to the Hartford Whalers, the Pittsburgh Penguins, back to the Flyers, then over to Detroit. Won 2 Stanley Cups with the Flyers. Scored 50 goals once with Philadelphia. But in 846 games, he had scored 349 goals, 759 points. Then 114 playoff games, he had 54 goals for 107 points. We have New York Rangers right winger Rod Gilbert. He is the other part of the gag line with Gene Rattel and Vic Hatfield. The goal of game line, he is in the Hockey Hall of Fame, 2-time All-Star. He won the 1975-76 Masterton. Spent his entire 18-year career with the New York Rangers. Went to 1 Stanley Cup final, which they lost against Boston. Was in the Summit Series as well. 1,065 games, 406 goals, 615 assists for 1,021 points, plus minus a 38. And in 79 playoff games, he had 34 goals, 33 assists for 67 points. So he was a playoff performer. He was also the last of the gag line as Vic Hatfield was traded to Pittsburgh later on, and then Rattel went to Boston. Now we're going to one of the favorite players in the NHL, the old years. Right winger for the Toronto Maple Leafs, Eddie Shack. Clear the track, here comes Shack. I actually met him at a hockey banquet when I was a kid. He was so drunk, his nose was bright red, and he was making Italian jokes. And one of our hockey coaches at the time, Tunner DeAngelis, was Italian, was laughing too. It's funny. He'd actually started his career with the New York Rangers, then went to the Toronto Maple Leafs, Boston Bruins, LA Kings, Buffalo Sabres, Pittsburgh Penguins, and then back to Toronto. 17 years in the NHL. Over 1,000 games. Scored 239 goals for 465 points. Was a minus 111 in his career, though. In the playoffs, he scored 74 games. He had 6 goals, 7 assists for 13 points. So he wasn't exactly a goal scorer, but he won 4 Stanley Cups with Toronto. A funny guy, a shit disturber. Got himself kicked out of Boston for making fun of the general manager at the time. I believe it was the general manager. So he's traded from Toronto to Boston for Murray Oliver. Boston won that deal. Traded from Boston with Ross Lonsberry to LA for Ken Turlick, who round 1 pick in the 71 draft, Ron Jones, and round 1 pick in the 73 draft. So him and Lonsberry were traded for a lot, but I don't know who Ken Turlick is. Ron Jones never amounted to much. Andre Savard had an okay career. And then in 1970, traded from LA with Dick Duff and future consideration to Buffalo for a player to be named later, Mike McMahon. Buffalo won that deal. And then traded from Buffalo Sabres to Pittsburgh Penguins for Reen Robert. Pittsburgh blew it on that trade. And then went back to Toronto probably as a free agent. Funny guy though, hilarious. I have his autograph, I can't remember where I put it though. Because back then a lot of NHL players would make money by going on the banquet circuit, kids' banquet circuits. And then the last card I got from Beyond the Pond is California Golden Seals defenseman Terry Murray. This is a rookie card. He was drafted in the 7th round, 88th overall in the 1970 amateur draft by California. Played parts of 3 seasons with him before going to Philadelphia and then Detroit, Philadelphia, and Washington. Played 303 NHL games, 4 goals, 80 points. Well, he's a defenseman. And then played 18 playoff games where he had 2 goals for 4 points. So not exactly a high-scoring defenseman. As a coach, though, he coached the Washington Capitals for 4 years. Then the Philadelphia Flyers for 3 years. Florida Panthers for 2.5 years. Back to LA for 3.5 years. And finally, he's pretty much done coaching. He took the Philadelphia Flyers to the 97 Stanley Cup Final, but they lost to Detroit. And had some playoff success, just couldn't get over Couldn't take Washington over the hump. Lost in round 3 in 90. Philadelphia lost in round 3 in 95. Then lost the final. And couldn't get LA Kings over the hump in the 2010-11. But as a coach, won a lot of games. It wasn't all that bad. So in 70-70, he was traded from Philadelphia Flyers with Bob Ritchie, Steve Coates, and Dave Kelly to Detroit from Mike Corney and Rick LaPointe. I'd say Philly won that deal. And then claimed off waivers by Washington Capitals from Philly in 81. So he didn't play a lot. But there we have it. 7 cards from the 73 O-pee-chee set. Excellent cards to go along with the 5 cards from the 72 set. So all you hockey card fans out there, let me know who in this group was your favorite player. Who do you think was your favorite? Bernie Parent, Frank Mahovlich, Gilbert, Busick, Rattel, Eddie Shack? Leave comments in the comment section. Until next time, this has been Hockey Night in Belmont.